So I would like to thank Alex for inviting me to speak today and for all of you for being here. My role today is to give you a philosophical perspective on the themes of today's conference, children and authenticity, and to give you a sense of the originality of the work that the Guild is doing. I'm involved in philosophy for children, and I say that now because I may not get to it in the talk, but I am around for the entire day if you're interested to talk further about what philosophy for children is and how it works and what it involves. So my goal for today is simply to explain why it is that we rarely connect childhood and authenticity, and vice versa, authenticity and childhood. So today we have a concept of childhood which finds expression in the literal and metaphorical separation of children from the world of adults. We have children's meals, children's spaces, children's clothes, children's games, and children's movies, and we can continue that list ad infinitum. Conceiving of childhood as a developmental stage in the human life cycle, we regard it comparatively using adulthood as the norm. In other words, we focus on how the child will develop as he or she moves into adulthood. We think of the child as moving from immaturity to maturity, from dependence to independence, from pre-morality to morality. We rarely question our concept of childhood because it grounds what we take to be morally appropriate treatment of children. As adults, we assume responsibility for children, making decisions on their behalf. We tell them what Plato refers to as noble lies in the interest of their own well-being and development. And we prohibit child labour, child abuse, child pornography, and child marriage on the grounds that these are grave injustices. Scholarly research in feminism, race theory, and queer theory has demonstrated the extent to which we fail to acknowledge members of powerless social groups. As with other historically powerless groups, it is no accident that children, like blacks and women, are associated with attributes that are inversely related to our humanity. Children are viewed as insufficiently rational, insufficiently self-determining, insufficiently mature, insufficiently moral, and lacking in self-awareness. In other words, we are inclined to view childhood as a deficit. It is certainly not an occasion of wisdom. This conception of childhood is so pervasive that we fail to notice its presence, for to critique it would require us to observe children and adults from a point of view outside our own thinking about them. Some images to reflect that. One in particular. The accusation is that we don't take children seriously as authorities regarding their own experience. Some philosophers of childhood have proposed the term adultism to characterize our prejudicial relationship to children. These philosophers invite us to overcome this prejudicial relationship by giving each and every individual child an equal place in the scheme of normative attention and concern. Their assumption is that if children could express themselves articulately and sincerely, they would tell a very different story from the one that we attribute to them in virtue of their being children. Adults have epistemic and ethical reasons then for overcoming adultism. Our epistemic reason is that adultism presents an obstacle to truth. Adults miss out on whatever knowledge children are able to provide. And as an obstacle to truth, adultism impoverishes our existential possibilities. Adultism is also unethical because to undermine the child in his or her capacity as a subject or as a knower is to inflict both literal and symbolic harm. It is to imply that the child is less than fully human or less than fully authentic. So now I move to authenticity. Generally speaking, we think of authenticity as something good. Sometimes we use the term in the context of forms of life and the extent to which they are true or fall away from our true human nature. For example, it is sometimes said that modern or contemporary society is sometimes said of modern or contemporary society that the condition is one of alienation. In other words, we can no longer identify with ourselves or our world. We are estranged from that which is meaningful in life, desires, actions, roles, and relations. More specifically, though, authenticity is used as an evaluative term to characterise a person's desirable relationship to himself or herself. It's associated with individual self-determination and individual self-realisation. It is an essential aspect of our social existence that we be able to regard ourselves as we appear to others. But it is also an essential aspect of our living well that we not entirely succumb to how others see the world, including ourselves. We must be able to give meaning to things, interpreting them independently, rather than simply internalising socially acceptable interpretations of the world. It is important, therefore, not to lose a degree of subjective freedom and a sense of self. This requires that individuals both be immersed in society but also critical of society and their place within it. It requires that the individual recognise that the aspects of her life that she experiences as determined or given actually result from free will. It requires that the individual take a risk in being socially different. To be authentic is to be true to oneself, or to belong or be fully oneself. Now, this way of thinking about authenticity suggests an ideal of integrated selfhood or successfully achieved subjectivity. If to be authentic is to be true to oneself, then one must first know who one is. This implies that it is possible to have a unified understanding of the self. In other words, authenticity requires a self that I can be true to. This self is conceived as having a coherent story, as Brian mentioned. It narrates the development of the individual moving towards greater integration, having overcome conditions of isolation, fragmentation, and incoherence. To think of authenticity, though, as requiring an integrated or unified self makes it prohibitive for children. The child only enters into authenticity as he or she matures into adulthood. For this reason, I want to offer another way of thinking about authenticity that is common in the philosophical literature. It's to think of authenticity as abiding self-presence. To be true to oneself is to be true to the process of self-transformation. It is to focus instead on living wholeheartedly. In the language of Dewey, authenticity combines cultivated naivety and force of character. Cultivated naivety describes a willingness to be open to each and every new situation. It consists in a focused engagement with things and others, allowing the self to be called forth by encounters. The other side of cultivated naivety is force of character. It is the preparedness to take up one's personal commitments as one's own, even though they may be irreconcilable or incommensurable with the ethical norms of the day. Dewey describes it as having the power to stand up and count for something in the actual conflicts of life. This conception of authenticity is more available to children because it focuses less on the realization of a unified self and more on the process that is characteristic of selfhood, namely becoming oneself or self-corrective growth. We know that children are capable of both cultivated naivety and force of character. And now I just want to say a few words about my involvement in philosophy for children, which is, I think, another approach to acknowledging and encouraging the authenticity of children. Philosophy with Children is an international movement that originated a little over 40 years ago when Anne Margaret Sharp and Matthew Lipman designed a curriculum and a pedagogical approach intended to expose children and adolescents to central concepts and principles of philosophy. Influenced by American pragmatism, they conceived of philosophy as an endeavour of collective inquiry, beginning with problematic experiences and leading toward warranted judgments. And you'll find lots of information about philosophy for children on the web. But for the moment, I want you to imagine a classroom of small individuals sitting around a circle, looking back and forth at one another and earnestly listening to what each has to say. You'll hear them contesting such concepts as friendship or fairness, asking for reasons, offering experiences from their own lives to serve as examples and counterexamples, and proposing hypothetical solutions. You see the thinking on their faces, their expression of delight and surprise on hearing another's idea, quiet wondering, laughter, and the alternatively authoritative and playful ways they express themselves by straightening and twisting their bodies. There is beauty in the symphony of different voices, the rhythmic contrast between sound and silence, the ebb and flow of intensity, and the interweaving of different thematic concerns. Finally, you imagine children gauging the development of their own intellectual community by evaluating the relevance of their discussion and determining whether everyone spoke, practiced good thinking, and advanced their understanding. If we withhold from children the possibility of philosophical engagement, we deprive them of an epistemic and ethical good. It is an epistemic good because the children are engaged in philosophical inquiry with reference to their own experience, They ruminate together on life's big questions in an effort to take greater responsibility for their lives. The invitation from adults to children to philosophize is an ethical good by way of its symbolic function. It identifies at the same time as it contributes to the common humanity of children, acknowledging them as full members of the ethical community it invites them to be part of. For to philosophize with children is to assume that the child is not a provisional human being on the way to adulthood. Rather, children, like adults, are endeavouring to live better, more meaningful lives with the potential for wisdom and the ability to shape and educate our adult understanding on how to live better. Thank
you. Would you two prefer to sit down for Q&A, or what would work best?
I'm happy to sit, or I'm happy to stand.
We have several minutes for Megan and Brian to take questions. Please.
Hi, thank you, Will. I have a question for first. You were forced to go a little fast over a little part of it, and one of the things that I found so intriguing was your table of things that are related to authenticity as a measure. And one in particular is mindfulness. And there's a lot of mindfulness going on in the schools now and with children, and I'm one of the proponents for that. And I've noticed kids getting what looks like more authentic as they get more mindful, and I'm wondering about the precise nature of that relationship as you've seen it play out in research.
My sense for it is that mindfulness is sort of an activity that people do. It's an approach, and that the benefit of mindfulness, at least as I would see it, is how it contributes then to those authenticity components. Because by being in the here and now, by recognizing one's internal experience in the moment that it's happening, one is cultivating a deeper self-understanding. They're coming to recognize sort of at a somatic level what they're experiencing. They're also recognizing their likes, their preferences, their discomforts, and so forth, and that all of those things are valuable, insightful self-knowledge in which to more deeply understand the self and to recognize the construction of self. Is that?
Yeah, it's great. And a follow-up question to that is that, can your measure of authenticity be used as a measure of growth in terms of authenticity? So can you use it once and that's the person's character? It's a disposition? Or
no, I think of it as an ongoing process.
Okay.
So yeah, absolutely. There have actually been some research that's looked at it more sort of longitudinally kind of deal. But yeah, absolutely. Look, the bottom line is I don't think authenticity is an outcome that people either have or don't have. It's the ongoing experience that one has in the engagement of those four interwoven processes. Because our circumstances always change. Right, so it's still about fundamentally then how it is that you grow and develop given the constraints and affordances of the environment.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Brian, you used the term self-authoring, which suggests Robert Kegan's work about the development of frames of mind as a developmental pathway of human cognitive capacity. I'm curious if either of you is familiar with his work.
I'm not offended. I'd like to get the reference later on when I could jot it down, actually.
I mean, the idea is that separate from the way we think about intelligence, human beings across a lifespan develop the capacity to push more elements to the objective field, which seems like a necessary capacity to continue the process of authenticity. So if neither of you are familiar with that, I'm not sure my question will make sense, but I'm curious if that developmental pathway is reflected in either of your work or perspective.
I'm not familiar with the work I'm sorry.
So it sounds like it's an inclination then toward the development of objectivity. That's certainly compatible with the notion of the unbiased processing.
Yes.
Robert Keegan, hopefully out of this day will come a list of resources that we'll all add to. So that'd be one to add. Thanks.
Please do.
Alex,
Oh, sorry.
running around the mic. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the idea of philosophy of the children and this beautiful picture that you painted of students sharing ideas and listening to one another, and how you are able to set up that safe space. Are you giving your students tools, sentence starters, any sort of active tool to sort of facilitate that type of conversation with your students?
Oops. Thank you for your question. It's a terrific question, and I think one of the lovely things about, when I think about the work that the Guild is doing with art, I think philosophy shares with art this ability or space in which we can express ourselves and which we can ruminate on life without necessarily having to exercise our agency in life. And so it is perfect for children who have limited experience and limited opportunity. Within that, we definitely spend a lot of time setting up the space in which philosophical inquiry can occur, talking about what we call a community of inquiry and the characteristics of a community of inquiry. And then there's also a range of materials that are used to stimulate the inquiry. And that can be children's literature, children's film, sort of novels or stories written by philosophers for different age groups, intended to raise different sorts of issues. And the emphasis is on giving them a space in which they can engage with each other in dialogue and take each other and each other's life experiences seriously. So the teacher or facilitator is there really just to kind of be a caretaker of the procedures and to prepare philosophically rich stimulus materials.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. For both of you, since we are an institution that is concerned and focused on teacher education and cultivating educators, I'm wondering if you would both be willing to conjecture about the applicability of both of your positions with regards to professional development and teacher education.
Yeah, I can say a little bit more about that just because I do work in teacher and teacher education. I do think that it has tremendous potential, but I think perhaps one of the things that has to happen first is that we have to reconceive teaching as a deeply intellectual pursuit. Not any less practical, but in that practice, deeply intellectual, concerned with questions about what is the good human life, what is human nature, and how is it that we move from what our nature is to a state of well-being. And then I think once we do that, teachers are far less threatened by reconstructing conceptions of childhood or leaving conceptions of childhood open so that children's voices can actually have a role to play in what we take to be the different stages of the life cycle, including adulthood. So there's a lot of work to be done here, and it's not a good time for teachers as well. There are tremendous pressures on them. So it is about sort of taking seriously their concerns and finding ways to respect their expertise.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Sorry, you're right.
It's fine.
You can have mine.
It's a collaborative world. So, short version would be that I think developing authenticity as a part of professional development is part and parcel then to the longevity, duration, and dedication that one's going to have in the experience. That fundamentally what teachers, I think, look, I'm saying this on the outside sort of looking in, but that, okay, on the outside looking in, let me say it like this. I think that we get too locked in on focusing on academic scores. We need to be thinking about developing social emotional development and developing citizens, people living in the real world. Ultimately, you're not a number based on an academic outcome. And so giving teachers the strength in which to see their children not as a test score, but rather as a whole entity that someday is going to contribute and give back and be a meaningful member of society is going to strengthen and empower the dedication that they have because of the amount of sort of quality of work they get to do, the meaning inherently that goes with that. So, but I think by developing the authenticity components as part and parcel to professional development, the more authentic people are, I think the more they give back in supporting authenticity for others. And so I think if that is a part of the professional development of teachers, they fundamentally then are going to be invested in validating children's experiences and invested in their authentic development.
Great. Oh, one more question.
There's one more question.
Two more questions. Okay. And then we have to move on.
Thank you both for provocative presentations. I just want to ask you both, in what ways is your work coming from an intersectional perspective? So again, Megan, you mentioned in the same ways that we think about people of color and women, we should think about children as being prejudiced. And so my question is, I guess, Brian, are you looking at authenticity as different in these different identifiers that we have, and then as well in terms of childhood, is I guess the psychology of childhood different when we consider all these different identifiers and the social pressures and oppression that comes with those?
Mm-hmm. Okay, first of all then, limited background personally in child development, in that I am a social psychologist that worked with adults. But that being said, I certainly think it connects to child experience, and that's one of the things that I love about this conference. I'm hoping to sort of grow from that. As it relates to intersectionality of other groups, I actually have looked at things like that. And I think it's fascinating because in large part what I found actually is that groups that historically tend to be marginalized tend to be higher in authenticity. So despite the fact like a sort of traditional feminist perspective would say that the constraints of the situation would be so much that women's authenticity, their voices would be subverted. But if you think of authenticity, and that may be the case in general, but it depends on how you're thinking about authenticity. Because if authenticity is a relational aspect too, women far have superior relationships compared to men. And that part of the way in which we get to know ourselves is through the lens of what other people confer in the trust that we develop in their being able to share insights about who we are. I've also found that Black individuals report higher authenticity compared to non-Black individuals, or at least compared to white individuals. And I would suspect that that actually is because Black individuals have sort of greater burden to have to figure where they fit, and that there's a paradox of privilege of sorts. The paradox of privilege for white individuals is they tend to structurally sort of more inherently fit, and then they don't have to be invested in having to figure out who they are. Where for sort of more specialized persons or more marginalized persons, I think authenticity is even more essential an ingredient in their healthy functioning.
I don't know if I have much to add, except that I think that, I do just want to sort of raise people's consciousness about adultism and about the ways in which we commit what's called in social epistemology testimonial injustice towards children, because we think we know already what childhood is and what it means and what are the possibilities within that. Is that helpful as a response?
Kind of feeding off what you talked about both with the last question and this question, there are a lot of contextual issues or barriers that will prevent both the development of authenticity within the classroom with situations where children, and also obviously the philosophy for childhood. And so how have you been able to address some of those barriers, or what are some of the ideas you have about overcoming some of those barriers where we do have this high stakes testing and accountability that prevents sometimes teachers from just engaging with children on a real level? And again, it may not be a definitive answer, but just kind of bringing up the discussion.
Teachers will often report that one of the things they appreciate about doing philosophy with children is that it is an opportunity for them to just be with children, because it isn't something which is in the curriculum and therefore is not tested and therefore is less subject to the mandates that other subjects are. I think one of the things that we do in Philosophy for Children, rightly or wrongly, is that we encourage kids to talk about those obstacles amongst themselves, to both sort of name them and to talk about perhaps what the significance of that might be, and then for them to really think about strategies to address it. So when we self-evaluate at the end of a community of inquiry, we always sort of reflect on who spoke and who didn't, and try and encourage participation around those observations, because often it might be that the shy people didn't speak, or that the girls spoke less than the boys, or that children of colour did not speak as much as the white children. And then to talk about what the significance of that is and what might have to happen in order for that to change. It seems naive when I hear myself saying that, given how complex the issue is and how difficult. But that's about, I think, as far as we've got as a program. We're only 40 years old. Exposing, I mean, one of the exciting things that I think is available to us that I see happening in the future is that curriculum begins to be developed that incorporates race theory, queer theory, and children then can be exposed to it. Just as in the novels that were written by Matthew Lipman and Anne Sharp, they're being exposed to, Rousseau and Plato, not with the names, but just in terms of the general ideas and questions. I see terrific potential for that with respect to some of the groundbreaking work that's being done now, theoretically.
I just want to quickly echo that I think we need to change the culture of how we see education, and from the standpoint of celebrating our differences and recognizing that our own individual story is inherently intertwined with the story of others. So really embracing diversity is an opportunity not just for empowering individuals then who historically are marginalized, it's also an opportunity to empower and liberate ourselves in a more authentic way.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Thank you both so much. I think this is a wonderful way to dive into the subject of the entire day. I wanted to make a couple of comments. Terry, I think, mentioned that it would be great to share resources. One of the things that definitely will happen after the conference is that we will launch a private community online on a platform called Ning, where we will be able to share our resources and ideally continue the conversation as we move forward. I also wanted to mention that we are actually exploring, as part of our own practice, bringing philosophy of education to supplement what we're already doing with creativity, and it's very exciting, so we'll keep you posted on that as well. And third thing, I know people are probably freezing. Even I'm really getting cold, and I'm usually hot. So we will, as we're moving on the next activity, we'll start working at that. The next part of the day is a table activity. So in groups at your tables, and this might be a good opportunity to redistribute yourselves a little bit. People are, I think, huddling for warmth, but if you're happy where you are, that's fine. Just as long as you're not the only person at your table, because that's going to be hard to have a discussion with yourself.